I went into Ready or Not's DLC maps with one big question. Could Void Interactive fulfill its ambitions with the odds stacked against them? With a shaky foundation, with heavily flawed design, and with questionable decisions? The answer, to nobody's surprise, is up in the air. I think this game is in a pretty good state. I would easily recommend it to anyone looking for a fun, immersive, tactical shooter, but there are still traces of its rocky launch. Could Void handle the scale, or would they try to tone things down? These two DLCs sort of did both. Let's start with some basic changes. First off, Talk has a new voice and it's great. He's calm, clear, and laid back just as he should be.
Talk to lead. Mission is complete.
It treads the line between talking to a friend and talking to a senior officer in a fully intentional way.
Element, this is Talk. Nice work, entry team. That's all of them.
Have you ever encountered a friend at their job thinking how they're behaving completely differently? It's hard to explain, but that's what I'm getting from this voice, and it makes every response much more effective. The light-hearted relief and praise when you complete your mission.
Talk to Element. Great job, entry team. Come home for debrief.
And the frustrated anger when things go wrong.
Entry team, this is Talk. Situation is diffused. With that said, there are no words for the display put on by the team today.
Absolutely abysmal.
abysmal.
Damn,
Oh my God.
bro. That's rough.
He sounds much less like a cheesy actor and more like a real person. I also noticed that he has some unique variations of voice lines when discovering particularly harrowing evidence.
Talk reporting. Secure it and keep going.
Judge himself gets some new voice lines too, similar to the container moment in Port Hogan on certain DLC maps. But he still hasn't gotten any for other things like reporting children or finding photographs. It would be nice to see those lines change too, because they still feel like placeholders. It still feels wrong that we can't have important voice lines instead of quips.
Looks like there was a bit of a party in here. Didn't end too well.
Что ты на меня грешишь, кума? Я не твоих козлят.
Something I neglected to mention in my first long analysis of every level was the police station. If you're playing in commander mode, the station will change over time, going from its simple beginning, expanding and opening up as you clear more levels, with the DLCs then adding huge environmental changes. Following the hurricane at Port Hogan, the station is in shambles, and when Dark Waters begins, it seems to be in the midst of a re-election campaign. Alongside these are new conversations in the police station with cops chatting to each other, arguing, or simply being. In spite of how repetitive and frankly uninteresting these conversations are, it's a very appreciated touch that brings just a little bit more life to this world. There's also been a lot of changes to NPC AI. I never had too much of an issue with it, even on release, and always thought the complaints were a little overblown, especially after I managed to S-rank every level. This update definitely makes things easier, but tries to add the trade-off of more unpredictability. The one you'll notice the most is the new surrender for suspects. Some might still fling their gun up to the ceiling and surrender when caught by surprise, but more often than not they'll have a long-winded lowering of their weapon, during which they can either psych you out and raise it again, or fully lower the weapon and surrender. It's a nice little minigame that forces you to hold your attention on an enemy. It's not perfect right now. For one, they'll keep saying their usual defiance voice lines while surrendering, which can kinda contradict what they're doing.
I'm not putting anything down. I'm not putting anything down. I'm not putting any. I'm surrendering.
It would also be nice to have a cleaner transition between the gun lowering animation and the actual surrender, since their move to their knees is very sudden. But it's a nice system nonetheless, and certainly more readable than what was implemented in SWAT 4. I've also noticed that suspects seem to take hostages more often, but they sometimes decide to execute the hostages and proceed to miss their shots at point blank range, which, while admittedly funny, is, you know. Finally, I've noticed that surrendering suspects sometimes shift away from you, which alerts their teammates to your position. Where is she going? What? She's not complying.
Hands up! Over here! Hands up above your head! Hands up! Drop to your knees!
I think it's a suspect. It's a really nice point of difficulty that doesn't require entirely mechanical solutions. It feels like there's a focus on how you think rather than simply how well you can shoot, and that is a very good sign. Of course, that's not to say that there are no issues. For one, I think the AI is now way too easy, and I would very much prefer the old one to this. Void has announced a difficulty system to be introduced, and while it is a step in the right direction, I hope they'll accordingly rebalance the current middle difficulty to be a little more challenging. We also have the bugs. A particularly frustrating one that happens pretty often is the AI entering a limbo between surrender and defiance, meaning they'll sometimes stand up and refuse your commands forever, or surrender but not allow you to cuff them. It's ended a decent number of S-rank attempts and it is very frustrating. The teammate AI could also use a little polish. I don't want them to auto-restrain people in front of an open doorway. I don't want them to block tight paths. I want a better indicator of where they should deploy their flashbang. Post-game rescue teams still don't work properly half the time. Civilian AI feels largely unchanged, though I have noticed that many seem to run around the map at high speeds towards you after you bring order to chaos, which is very much appreciated. A side issue though is that civilians may surrender at any point when you shout, even through a wall or far away when you can't see them. These civilians often stay in that surrender position indefinitely and don't pathfind to you after order is brought to chaos. This is fine with SWAT AI who can pathfind to them, but miserable in solo or multiplayer games. It would be appreciated if they got up and headed towards you, which would stop the ever-present hunt for the last civilian. But I have noticed a pattern in my complaints, and that's that they're seemingly getting smaller, and that's honestly really nice. The AI isn't the only thing that's changed. It seems like the Unreal Engine 5 move brought some visual changes to Carriers of the Vine, which is noticeably less washed out in color. I'm not sure if the removal of these filters was a fully intentional choice, but I actually really like it. The lack of over-exaggerated color grading works really well. I think it sells the compound's realism without going overboard. Besides the AI art room. There's something to be said about this color grading being less scary, but I like the increased contrast between this beautiful location and the twisted psychology around its creation. The Unreal Engine 5 move does seem to have caused some problems. The inflatable tube man in CS's car dealership is now still as a statue. I've also noticed that the game runs significantly better, which is always a plus. There's been a bunch of little changes which I'm glad for. While the ragdolling after cuffing a suspect is still there, it's noticeably less severe. Though that hasn't stopped some suspects from phasing into Hades after being cuffed, or from flying across the map when you throw them. Please do not fix this one, it's very funny.
1, 2, deep!
I have 2 bottles of mace?
Oh my god!
Whoa! Where'd that guy go?
The game as a whole is cleaner. It's got a long way to go still, but it feels polished enough for me to consistently enjoy it. The gameplay with suspects is easier on the gunplay side while being more challenging in strategy, thanks to the potential fake surrenders, the more frequent hostage taking, and the alerted enemies. With just a few tweaks to make it more challenging, I'd be perfectly fine with them shifting to focus on content and art because I think the foundation is now in a stable enough place. When I say content and art, I specifically mean content that isn't directly gameplay related. Because while I think the game plays wonderfully, I don't think it's anywhere near what it ought to be. For one, none of the non-English voice lines sound, well, good or realistic. The accents and foreign languages are atrocious, and with so many improvements to the English-speaking voices, the fact that these other languages remain so poorly represented is honestly insulting. The Tran family's letter is in horrid Vietnamese, the Spanish voice actors are performing at the bare minimum, and half of the images in every single game location are AI generated. This game may be fun to play, but it's nothing like a complete product. With all that out of the way, I suppose it's time to talk about the DLC itself. Let's begin with Home Invasion. Radionaut's base campaign ended right before a hurricane, that incoming storm being the backdrop for its most intense and climactic set-piece. Home Invasion begins in that hurricane's wake. Back when I discussed Twisted Nerve, I made a point of how that map used color and implied function to differentiate its areas and make everything distinct, and Dorms takes a few notes from that. But unlike Twisted Nerve, Dorms doesn't feel nearly as coherent. The Greenside dormitories are the level's namesake, and like many other places in Los Sueños, they've been destroyed by the hurricane. Their layout is a large hallway with rooms flanking the sides. It varies this with destroyed walls, crawl spaces, and a second floor filled with homeless people. It attempts to feel chaotic, and yet it isn't really. I don't honestly have much to say on this level in terms of layout because it's very simple and very small, almost comparable to Ends of the Earth, albeit with more suspects and a less interesting set piece. It doesn't make much use of collapsed architecture, of shortcuts and crawl spaces as you'd think, even though there are so many of them. Besides the occasional short exchange between crawl spaces, there's a disappointing lack of map interaction. There's even a hole on the second floor that looks down at the first, but enemies never shot me through it. It's a very simple layout, and while not bad, it also doesn't say much. Ends of the Earth, Twisted Nerve, and Sword Force Fairfax, while being simpler and smaller, told a story as you went through, shedding light on the nature of the location and of its residents. And in spite of its connections to the game's ARG, this set piece feels particularly worn out. Especially when I get to the second floor and discover another religious paranoia drug cult setup thing. These dorms seem to be testing grounds for the MLO's experiments. But I feel like that only works through niche implication, and I've seen much of this before in better levels. I can even see pieces of those levels in here. The aluminium strips from Gerard Scott's house, which felt so unique to that map. The candles and graffiti from Twisted Nerve, which created a similar atmosphere in a more well-designed layout. A Catholic altar from Rust Belt, once used to symbolize something surprisingly poignant, turned into another piece of creepy imagery. I'm not saying it's not visually arresting, I mean, look at this detail.
You know the chapel?
Yeah.
There is like a makeshift stained glass that they made using the beer bottles.
Oh my god. That's insane. But am I intended to read this as a church, a refuge for the homeless to gather together in the face of this storm? Because that would be somewhat interesting. But no, it seems like I'm supposed to see this and attribute it to crazy people and a secret society that up until this point was only known within an ARG. This map is very good looking, with water dripping from the ceiling and parts of the roof caved in thanks to the hurricane. The way lights are set up to cast stark shadows down this hallway. The way blue tarp draped over open ceilings varies the color of light. Even the exterior is gorgeous, looking proper apocalyptic in the wake of all this destruction. I'm not going to say that Dorms is a bad level, but it does feel a little less whole than many of Radionaut's missions. As an opening, I suppose it makes sense to set up the hurricane's destruction, which is the DLC's main thematic link, as well as the ARG. But I can't help but feel like some parts of it were put aside. Like the experience of playing the map was secondary to its story implications, which are so shrouded in vagueness and niche mystery that it's a little hard to fully appreciate it. As for the suspects, there isn't much on them either. In demanding 5 arrests and with the cop outside on a stretcher showing sympathy for their plight, it seems like the game wants you to pity them. And I do by their very nature, especially following such devastation. But in an attempt to feel more morally grey, it seems like they tried to counterbalance this by making them intimidating, in a way that feels less natural than intended. Dorms serves as a good enough opener, establishing the destruction yielded by the hurricane. It's visually impressive and sets a mood for Home Invasion. But much like Carriers of the Vine, it feels caught between two places. It tries to be a nuanced depiction of those struggling in Los Sueños, but adds an element of conspiracy that I personally feel undermines the former's themes. I enjoyed Dorms well enough, but I don't think it holds a candle to the maps that come after, especially this next one.
They've got these 3 Vietnamese brothers, the trans, modifying weapons for them. That happens off-site, I don't know where. But they mod them up, and then the weapons are loaded up onto the trucks and sent to the port. Everything goes through the port. I don't know the dock number yet, but I'm working on it. If you want to catch them in the act, then that's your best bet.
The first thing you see when you enter Hope Street's first building is a chair soaked in blood, bathed in the glow of a fallen, flickering lamp. Bloody footprints lead to the backyard. Out in the distance, you can hear thunder rumbling. A storm has already passed through here when we arrive, and so we're left to chase it. In its opening moments, Narcos is already compelling. We're hunting down an undercover detective who's been captured by Los Locos, and so we have to scour a familiar neighborhood for where he's been taken. And this level is part of why I never took some game complaints seriously, because in spite of its large size, this map is laid out in an excellent manner. Narcos has a constant shifting between very open and very enclosed areas as you move from house to house, between alleyways, fences, and debris. Each house has varying levels of destruction, either from the hurricane or from a home invasion. Rooms have windows to watch out for, whether outside or in. The informant's bloody footprints lead you to his location at the end of the neighborhood, though you'll likely have to make a few detours along the way. The funny thing is, I wasn't expecting myself to really enjoy this map. Really, Void, you want me to go through a whole neighborhood filled with open areas, windows, and clutter? How's this any different from Dorms visually? And I couldn't be more wrong, because this may genuinely be my favorite map in the game. Narcos makes Ready or Not feel like a cover shooter in a really natural way. As you push further into the neighborhood, cover gets more sparse, but it's always there, and so it becomes this little game of circling around enemies as they constantly do the same, fleeing into or through houses trying to flank you. Sound feels especially important in preventing someone from shooting you in the back, and teamwork to pincer and shut down enemies is one of the most satisfying feelings ever.
Put your hands up.
Oh yeah, he did.
One down. What's that? One more. Ran to around the left side of the house.
Yeah, yeah, I'm wrapping.
I'm going around the left.
One in the door. In the window. Oh, I think he's got
Police, you're under arrest.
I think he wrapped something. Got him?
Nice.
Got him? Yeah.
Talk to element. Medical assistance is standing by.
It might be easy to expect more of the same for this level. Ready or Not is no stranger to ruined, destroyed environments, places of poverty long since deprived of their original purpose. But Narcos doesn't really do that. Every house in this level is full of visual clarity with interiors of varying quality and levels of destruction. Some lucky ones appear untouched while others are decimated. Some are a little barren and organized while others have clearly stopped being residential for a long time. A dead dog is lying in one such apartment, killed as the informant was dragged through. Looking in its bedroom, we can see that dog's rug and chew toy. The informant's own apartment has a hidden alcove behind a shelf filled with LSPD documents and recordings. The houses all have uniqueness in their interiors, and so the difficulty comes from distinguishing them outdoors. So long as you plan out a proper direction, it's never an issue in spite of all of the fallen bricks, ruined fences, and debris. You only get punished if you go in without a plan, if you only push from the right and ignore the left, or vice versa. As you move between areas, you've got to constantly be looking around lest you get mowed down. The map is a constant location for firefights with the same enemies because there are so many places to fall back to, but not enough for this to be problematic. You can get a good but not overly easy sense of where an enemy retreats to, and I think it hits a perfect balance of quantity and quality of gunfights. There won't be too many shootouts, but each lasts longer than you might expect, and the spacing and variation means you'll likely get a combination of close quarters and long range combat. Enemies will shoot at you a little and run deeper into the neighborhood, meaning you may have to keep your eyes out for open doors and bullet holes. They have durable body armor and a lot of places to run and hide, which helps the gunfights last longer, allowing the level to be a decent challenge while only having 8 to 10 suspects. And while all of this is happening, the music carries you through. Like I've mentioned before, sound design has always been one of my favorite aspects of Ready or Not, and the soundtrack for Narcos is a very good example. Much like every other mission featuring Los Locos, the use of distorted guitars works wonders. And the music feels especially prominent on this mission, not just within combat encounters, but as environmental ambience.
Element talk.
This is Talk. Roger, Energy.
Inside their homes and off the streets in and around the area of Hope Street and 213 Park. The LSPD have advised that they are dealing with the situation and request that all members of the public.
Many other missions are constantly subdued until a burst of gunfire rings out, but Narcos is constantly upbeat, and it makes the mission feel viscerally effective. As gunfire begins, so does the percussion. Mike Esperanza's info was partially responsible for the raid on Caesar's car dealership and Port Hogan. He'd noticed his photograph being taken a few days before the incident, but the hurricane prevented him from being extracted, his text messages not coming true. And when we move through the neighborhood, his distant screams of agony get louder and louder. It's harrowing, and when we see what's been done to him, it hurts. This sort of violence is, unfortunately, not unlike reality. Coming down from this high of gunfire, Ready or Not tries to show the sobering truth of this job, just as it always has. In spite of your superior firepower and strategy and technical moral high ground, in many ways you might still be helpless. There is something about Esperanza's blood, his scars, his nakedness that feels so much more disturbed than the bullet holes we leave, so distant and emotionless. This torture is vindictive and it is painful, especially knowing that this isn't the last we'll see of this gang, which only seems to get stronger every minute. When you report to Esperanza, the music goes from its intense, classy, distorted guitar to a melancholic low. Narcos is my favorite mission in Ready or Not, surprising even myself, but that's not to say that any of the other missions are bad. In fact, I'd put Dark Waters above Home Invasion. But Narcos strikes this perfect balance between the grounded, small-scale missions like in SWAT 4 and the tone, design, and aesthetics of Ready or Not. And above all, it makes me want more.
Recap on some fast facts regarding Hurricane Antonio. We're looking at winds of up to 170 miles per hour with gusts up to 190. As Antonio continues to move across these regions, we're going to start to see more flooding and...
Hurricane Antonio has now been upgraded to a Category 5 storm. Extensive damage to large parts of Los Sueños is expected, and certain areas are likely to be uninhabitable.
An underlying theme in Ready or Not has always been a critique of those in power, in positions of privilege and authority. You could disagree on this, but characters like Amos Vall and now Sven Anderson Lincoln feel like a prime example. Your last two missions took place in devastated buildings and homes, but this mansion still stands proudly. And though Anderson Lincoln is not a suspect but a victim, much of this mission does harken back to that disturbing mansion in white. But there are many things that are different here. Compare the modern architecture of the Vole Health House, which almost drains away any personality or humanity, to the lived-in feeling of this mansion, one that feels like more care was put into its design. It's draped in a gentle blue night, while Vole's was sterile, white, and soulless, more like a front. The rooms feel lived in, their wooden floors, lit closets, and kids' bedrooms being devoid of that underlying falseness and depravity that Vol's mention had. There are the kids' rooms, fully decorated, bedrooms for guests that are lovingly furnished, a cozy alcove with a pool table that I would kill for. Even the swimming pool is more visually appealing, and the guy's bathroom is just ridiculous. It's thematically fitting while also being a significant visual upgrade. The level is pretty simple in concept, while the number of rooms in the mansion is pretty standard. Each one is noticeably bigger, which makes navigation feel very comfortable. You'll never be cramped by your AI, which tends to happen on some tighter maps, and so moving around feels much smoother. The very intentional downside of this is, of course, that you're more open. I noticed that I had way more confrontations take place between rooms rather than within them, especially compared to maps like Elephant, which are more unified and straightforward, and maps like Narcos, which involve lots of extended gunfights and flanks. In that way, Lawmaker is difficult while inversely being much simpler. A gunfight will probably last less than 3 seconds both for you and the enemy in classic SWAT fashion. As you clear this house, the AI begins retreating upwards to the higher floors, deeper into the rooms, which creates this natural pacing that quite a few levels do, wherein the threat becomes more dangerous the deeper into the map you go. There are multiple open staircases up and down, meaning you can't reliably clear a single linear path to avoid flanks. There's always the chance that more enemies show up on your floor than you may have expected. Much like Narcos, it only has around 9 enemies, but it's deceptively hard despite its simple layout and premise because of the multiple access points. A lot of rooms connect to each other, meaning you may have to follow a trail of open doors to track down a running suspect. This is another level where door wedges felt essential. I neglected to mention in my initial video that Valley of the Dolls was actually cleared top to bottom, meaning there was a lot of vertical challenge. There isn't much of that in Lawmaker, which is a much more traditional realistic CQB clearing. It's very basic, but that's not a bad thing. It's the closest to the home invasion response fantasy that a lot of people were clamoring for, and I don't really have a problem with its size. And in this way, Lawmaker takes from Valley of the Dolls while being distinct, creating a level that stands on its own. And while its design is simpler and arguably less innovative, it's competent and carried by its significantly improved visuals. But one thing remains that's shared between both mansions. The destruction of this property is notable, sure, but it's nothing in the face of the last 2 levels, devastated by a hurricane and taken advantage of afterward. Just like Vol's mentioned, it's a complete contrast from the poverty and disaster-stricken levels that we had before. The worst that Anderson Lincoln gets to his mansion is a fallen chandelier and clothes stained in oil. Anderson Lincoln is depicted with empathy. After all, he took in the family of Raoul Valle and asks for his family to be kept safe when you cuff him. Quite unlike Amos Vol and his own twisted familial obsessions. His family, his wife and child are in the panic room, and clicking on the intercom you can hear the baby sob.
Dock to entry team. Trailers en route.
Yes, yes, oh God, thank you. Please help us. I've got my children in here.
And yet, Ready or Not depicts the United Planet Front not as a primary antagonist here per se, but as a side effect. Primary suspect Tobias Gibson appears similar to Elaine Raskin from Carriers of the Vine, a person who appropriated a well-intentioned group into radicalism. The members are in over their heads, surrendering easily, looking far less mature or experienced than one might believe. And their twisted motivations are not baseless. We can see from evidence that in spite of all of Anderson Lincoln's empathy and kindness, his actions are still evidently corrupt. His new drilling platform is built too close to the city's fault lines, and he's well aware of the damage it'll deal to the already unstable environment, planning to obscure that by marketing its potential fuel recovery. And as we find out later down the line, that decision will come to bite him again. Lawmaker, like Ready or Not's main finale, ends with unanswered questions. There's no real conclusion to be drawn. I doubt Anderson Lincoln will change, just as Senator Fremont didn't. This is Los Sueños in all its glory, and the violence and evil that it spawned and festering with on every end. Ready or Not has little to say on these matters, it merely shows them to you in plain sight for everyone to see. And that ugliness only seems to get worse. This level and this DLC is good. It's not revolutionary change, but it is still an upgrade from the base game. Its level design isn't radically different, but it feels more confident in what it's trying to do. Its visuals are a direct upgrade, with everything being significantly more detailed. Its themes are just as conflicted and repetitive as ever, but not to a point where it feels like a proper flaw. Home Invasion is good, and if you asked me, I'd say it's worth the price for Narcos alone, but it may not be the step up that people might have hoped for. But I think that Dark Waters might be just that.
Air support has arrived, keeping eyes on the perimeter. Suspects have taken civilians hostage and are threatening to kill them. Go when ready.
In my video on Rainbow Six Siege, I made a distinction between the terms realistic and grounded. Realistic is, well, realistic, a commitment to capturing reality as accurately as possible. And Ready or Not, while more realistic than most shooters, is still not quite there. There's a clear element of exaggeration of style that the game has, and this entire DLC is a good example. Would 4 SWAT members of an underfunded PD really be sent onto a huge yacht on their own? No, of course not, but I think it's unfair to judge the game from that lens. This mission, and every other mission in Dark Waters, exists because it's cool, because it's a unique and interesting setting. There are many things that Ready or Not shows off with Dark Waters. New loading screens are here, dependent on whether you started from a boat or from a helicopter, and that helicopter is Dark Waters' highlight. Every mission in this DLC is monitored from above by a UH-60 Blackhawk, which circles the map and notes down civilians and suspects in its line of sight. You're informed of these with a compass location on comms, a visible spotlight from the helicopter, and a thermal imaging screen on your phone. This feature is fantastic. It creates a sense of scale, the idea that this mission requires more support. It's immersive, the chopper pilot frequently checking in and informing you on what it's doing. It also gives a little gameplay advantage for more open areas. There are a few issues I have with it though. Firstly, I'd like a bit more control over it. Not full control obviously, but maybe a request for it to come to my location or to sweep a certain direction of the compass. I'd also like to see the thermal camera from the corner of my screen, similarly to viewing a teammate's headcam. It's not necessarily realistic, but as it is, it feels very impractical to open the phone and be forced to stand still while I navigate to the helicopter button every time. As it is now, it's a cool feature, but ultimately a gimmicky novelty. The spotlight is easily the best part of the feature, and with just a few tweaks, this system could be even better. Mirage at Sea, much like Valley of the Dolls, is another level that feels like a power fantasy. Men like Sahid bin Khalid and Amos Vol most certainly do exist in reality, but they're never getting caught for their crimes. And much like Valley of the Dolls, our main perpetrator must be kept alive, left to likely be set free afterward. Khalid owns the Seraglio, wherein he tricks women on board and assaults them. Like many missions, the premise is its most realistic aspect. One of the 911 calls has the operator dismiss the concern voiced by the caller, wherein he describes a seemingly drunk woman being dragged on board the ship. It's intensely sad and true to life. The Seraglio itself is a pretty unique map in its very premise. It's essentially a mansion on the water, but being a yacht, it's got far more tight hallways, narrow paths, and little nooks and crannies. The living quarters are numerous and intimidating, the floors are varied in space and elevation, and it's not hard to get overwhelmed. Despite technically being a little small, the map is easy to get lost in, and doubly so thanks to a small but vital detail. If you've alerted the guards on the ship to your presence, whether that be via shouting or gunfire, a little timer begins. After that timer runs out, Khalid orders the execution of all civilians on board, likely to prevent them from testifying against him. At this point, all suspects on the map become active shooters similar to those in Elephant, only these ones are more likely to instantly kill civilians rather than simply incapacitating them. It's a harrowing moment when talk informs you of active shooters on site. This makes Mirage at Sea very conceptually similar to Elephant, wherein you have to quickly clear the map of shooters before civilians are harmed. Except unlike that map, you can prevent this from happening entirely by arresting Khalid quickly, preventing him from making the order. To me, it's a better designed incentive to rush through the map. In Elephant, it was a speedrun to take down 4 shooters, but Khalid is a hunt for a single person and, fittingly, a high priority target. And on a map this small, finding him quickly is not particularly difficult. This also means the other suspects can be scattered in more varied locations, as opposed to the shooters in Elephant, who had much more predictable spawns to make up for that rushing approach. But rushing to find Khalid means that you may not be as thorough when initially breaching your way through the yard. It's easy to get tunnel vision and miss a bunch of side rooms and little spaces where suspects are likely hiding. You might rush in to find Khalid, arrest him, and find yourself in a very vulnerable position in the middle of the ship. It's a pretty clever way to disorient you in a map that's already very lethal. Dark Waters maps in general are the most detailed in the game. There are a lot of little additions and features that you may not really see elsewhere. For one, you can report the ship's status to the Coast Guard from the bridge, telling them what the situation is.
This is LSPD SWAT. We have control of Seraglio, and we'll bring her into port.
You can also, thankfully, turn off the abysmal music upstairs. I wish you could do the same at Vol's mansion. You can move the television screen in the pool room up to create some cover and disable the alarm in the ship's basement. None of these do much of anything for gameplay, but their inclusion adds some immersion to a level that had the potential to feel very static. World interaction is sorely lacking in a lot of maps, and though these are small steps, I would love to see more additions like these in the future. The map in general is beautifully detailed, much like every other one in this DLC. The yard's many facilities, kitchen, relaxation areas, and sleeping quarters would all feel wonderful and cozy were it not a refuge for one of the game's many depraved rich leaders. The outcome of Mirage at Sea is unknown. We arrested Khalid, but does that really mean anything? The innocent have already been killed, those who tried to fight back or protect their friends. This mission, despite its flashy visuals and inherent power fantasy of taking down a complete scumbag, is surprisingly unsatisfying in a way that feels intentional. It's not really triumphant, and while few missions are, Mirage at Sea feels especially melancholic. We killed some security guards, but these people forced on board are either traumatized or dead. The main perpetrator lives still, this attack on his ship being little but a waste of his time. The Leviathan is a dragon of 7 heads, a creature of the waters, that which devours the greedy. Many will choose to begin this mission with the helipad, landing from the helicopter to a violent barrage of rain and wind. The water pelts against your goggles, the rig's emergency siren is constantly sounding. It's very dramatic. Makes for a great first impression, but spawning at the boat landing changes the tone of this mission completely.
This is the chopper on site and ready for your go. Target located north. Keep eyes sharp.
The United Planet Front is back, and this time even more deeply radicalized, like a hydra with a severed head. They're heavily armed, almost too heavily armed to simply be some radical environmentalists. Similarly to Carriers of the Vine, this group was manipulated by a select few individuals and are clearly receiving funding from an outside source. Their claimed motives don't seem too legitimate. The phone you find in evidence makes this even more clear, with the group being manipulated by a shadowy figure to sow chaos, just like the unknown figure that prompted the hostage-taking in Lawmaker. And I do wonder, is this mission really saying anything by resorting to conspiracy as its suspect's motivation? Is it justifying their naivete and their hatred? In spite of its attempts to seem nuanced, the United Planet Front just feels immature. Not just in their behavior and motivations, but also with how they're written. They feel like the game's least developed faction stuck in the shadow of something else. Pitiful environmentalists who claim to be fighting for the planet. At the same time, perhaps that's the point. People easily fooled into a belief system, radicalized by fear-mongering. And when the bodies fall in spite of promises of non-violence, it's already too late. It's not particularly interesting with them being so secondary to the plot. There isn't a trace of irony in their words or in their actions. Community sentiment on them can be boiled down to 5 simple words because there's really nothing else to them. Just stop oil on crack. But this almost childlike caricature almost feels serviceable and elevated to something that feels deeper than it is thanks to the level's presentation. Leviathan was always going to be the center of all this DLC's marketing. There's just something about the oil rig setting, grounded in the ocean with its constant noise and industrial chaos, that makes it a perfect spectacle. The sky is cloudy and brooding, and a storm rages against the rig. Leviathan only has 2 full floors with a few additional elevation points above. Similarly to most DLC maps, there isn't much verticality, but that's made up for with the complexity of each floor. The Blackwell rig is technically a square with buildings in the center, and there are 3 staircases that each lead up. There's also an additional top platform with a radio and rig controls. It sounds simple, but it really isn't. These central rooms each have multiple access points, meaning pushing into the center may move enemies out of it. This means, of course, a potential strategy would be to wedge off access points, but like most maps, there are NPC-only crawl spaces to make this even more challenging. There are also suspects that have no weapons but who are more resistant to your shots and who rush to alert their accomplices. Like mentioned at the beginning of the video, I had an enemy who ignored my orders to come towards me, instead moving over towards an accomplice while shouting for help. That's not to say the map doesn't have some tricks available to you. Since there are multiple access points, it's pretty practical to move around and flank an enemy. There's also plenty of opportunities to throw grenades in creative ways. It's a simple layout that's made deeper with just a few added challenges. Similarly to Mirage at Sea, 2 of your side objectives are to report the rig status to the Coast Guard.
This is LSPD SWAT. The rig has been taken over by extremists from the United Planet Front. Repeat, the rig has been taken over. We have heavy contact with the...
As well as shutting off the very loud alarm from the rig control center.
Dr. Element, great job, entry team. Come on.
There seems to generally be a lot more detail on this mission than many prior ones. It introduces unique mechanics that are exclusive to this level and the subsequent one, and they are very nice additions, so I'd maybe like to see a couple be added to older maps. For example, you can find these orange weapon caches around the area, which suspects can use to arm themselves if they don't have a weapon, or simply want an upgrade from a pistol. These caches can be closed and secured, but thankfully aren't required. These boxes are already on maps like Ides of March and Sins of the Father, but simply just not used by enemies, so they'd be cool to have there. There are also civilians here that are dead on arrival, but reporting them isn't a necessity either, making it a purely diegetic immersion-based addition. I'm not expecting this feature for maps like Neon Tomb, but it would certainly be a welcome addition to Elephant, especially given that map's lower body count in general. Not all of these civilians are dead either. Upstairs in the break area, you can hear the surviving members hiding in a blocked off corner, unreachable but undeniably present. One of my favorite little details on this map is a short scripted moment with the helicopter. When you make your way to this particular side of the rig, the chopper flies along the side, scanning it with its spotlight, lighting up the area and scouting it out for you. It's a little slow and ultimately not entirely practical or necessary, but it makes for such a cool moment. Reminiscent of the old Granite Hotel in SWAT 4, when a helicopter flew by to watch you in the construction area. I could imagine some older maps simply having a circling helicopter, especially those in high-rise buildings. It also adds the feature of the hostage room. In older maps, there weren't necessarily hostages per se. Even though Sins of the Father is canonically a hostage situation, the civilians are sort of just running about, as are the suspects. This mission introduces proper hostage taking in hostage rooms, which are randomized. Sometimes the hostages are being held in the central lower floor, and sometimes they're in the rig control room. These areas usually have a decent number of enemies patrolling it, meaning you'll have a different central location to push on replays. It's a very good addition to make the level more replayable. Leviathan doesn't necessarily feel like it has a lot to say thematically that hasn't already been said. It doesn't even seem to propel the story forward in a particularly interesting way. Lawmaker pretty much did the same thing on a smaller scale. But this mission is a mechanical success in nearly every way. It's engaging to go through, challenging but fair, and full of new mechanics and details, all of which make this oil rig feel complete and comprehensive as a level. And it's a very effective large-scale spectacle. It does make me wonder, though. With a map this big and committed to its detail and intensity, how could Void top this for the DLC's third and final level? Is it even going to try? If you've played Dark Waters, you already know the answer. It's pretty fitting that Ready or Not's DLC saved its most eerie mission for last. Letter Triad is one of the most visually impressive maps in the game, and it doubles down, once again, on this game's insistence on scale, spectacle, and conspiracy. It is their most absurdly difficult level, and one that is very tied into its ARG. I haven't spoken much about it in my videos because I always saw it as secondary to the main narrative, the level's hidden stories being less important than its overarching themes. But Letter Triad being named Letter Triad does not make pretenses. It's no longer in the background. I previously criticized Dorms for how it attempted to be two things at once. A simple small-scale mission showing the plight of those in Los Sueños, while also trying to be creepy to tie itself in with the elusive Triad. Carriers of the Vine suffered a similar problem where its underlying conspiracy felt like it undermined the themes it was trying to handle. But this mission has no such illusions. Letter Triad is first and foremost about that mystery, that large-scale grand conspiracy, and doesn't even pretend to be anything else. And for that, I really like it. Brutalism has always been associated with authoritarianism, so it's no surprise that the game's most mysterious faction, one with strong government ties, has made its home in the Elysian, a concrete resort for the wealthy that was never completed. It would be easy to make a level like this, well, forgettable, to make every room of grey blend into another, but brutalism has always come with accents of greenery with the careful consideration of light. The plants in Letter Triad are everywhere, overgrown, more prominent in some locations and absent in others, creating some much needed variety in this abandoned building. The same trick is done with shadows. Certain rooms are brightly lit by the hazy daylight, while others are more bathed in darkness. Lighting plays a pretty big part here. There are corners and rooms in this mission that are genuinely pretty dark and difficult to go through. This also gives Ready or Not another opportunity for some interactable features. Letter Triad has random spawns for these lights connected to generators. They can spawn in several different locations and start either on or off. In some areas, the glare of the light is obstructive to your vision, and so you may want to shoot them out to see better. In other rooms, such as this very difficult area, the light lets you see much more clearly if you turn it on. It's pretty awesome. Like most of Ready or Not, it's not perfect. After all, the lights don't affect enemy AI positively or negatively at all, which diminishes their function very much. But it's still a very cool feature to interact with, and hopefully a demonstration of future fancy interactables that Void may want to make. Weapon caches make a return as well, which allows the less armed pirates to gear up with stronger weapons. This mission is hard, often boasting around 20 suspects with only one civilian every time in a preset hostage room, much like in Leviathan. Dr. Schwartz is being held by a group of American and British mercenaries as well as South American pirates. The latter are the weaker group armed with pistols and smaller SMGs, while Black Sentinel, the PMC, wear full armor and carry deadly rifles. They're here, apparently, to conduct a trade. The room where this trade is conducted could be the 2-floor zone I mentioned earlier, but it could also be a massive open area on the first floor, the swimming pool near the loading bay, the massive cafeteria, the hotel lobby, or the smaller overgrown room to the right of the lobby. And similarly to the oil rig, this makes the mission more replayable and unpredictable, and even more so thanks to the high suspect count. They'll still be scattered about, but it's a very different combat challenge every time. Many suspects in a cramped room means less cover for you, but you'll be more likely to get a bunch of them with a single flashbang. Having them converge in a large space means you may have to very carefully manage them and move from cover to cover, and having them spawn in the 2-floor zone is a nightmare. The tools that the game gives you are pretty similar to Leviathan 2. Every room has multiple points of entry as well as lots of windows and holes to lob grenades through. The helicopter comes in to light up notable locations as well, with its spotlight being a very helpful guide in darker rooms. I spoke of Sins of the Father in my last video as a power fantasy of sorts. Letter Triad follows a similar pattern even if its visuals may feel like the opposite. Instead of a small furnished art deco hotel at night, we have a massive abandoned brutalist hotel on a cloudy day. Both are full of armed suspects and not too many civilians. Neither have the most meaningful story with an already familiar sounding premise to another level, and instead choose to hone in on style, and I think both succeed in different ways. Sins of the Father was simpler. It was a cool environment in a dark and stormy night, and you took down a terror threat. You were constantly in danger with no control over your claustrophobic restrictive environment. This, though, I think this mission above all others wants you to feel dangerous. It's difficult, yes, but I don't think any other mission is as thoroughly satisfying to fully clear. It is, after all, Radionaut's most difficult level yet. From the moment you step into the Elysian, you'll be greeted by these statues littered all across the map, watching and ever present. I don't like this.
Yeah, right, it's spooky.
Past this cracked wall, which you can blow open with explosives, you can find this. The Mariposa Lily organization is a remnant of the game's old PvP mode, and it seems to me that they're our new antagonists, possibly the focus of the next DLC. The mysterious compound is related to them, the graffiti in dorms implies it to be a drug testing ground for them, and Gerard Scott is explicitly name-dropped in a voice recording. The game's hints that Judge is not a normal person are not subtle in the slightest. Gerard Scott constantly brings you up, and the evidence in his home indicates that you're almost certainly some sort of sleeper agent. And what do you know, the achievements for this level are sleeper agent and a very long sentence that indicates that agent's identity. The former demands you take down 15 suspects within 15 seconds of each other. This is what you were made for, to be obedient, brutal, and ruthlessly efficient. What does all of this mean? What sort of narrative are they trying to weave? How is this any different from a Call of Duty game? The truth is, I don't know. This is yet another cliffhanger, one that could swing both ways. They could take another step back, going to smaller scale missions and focusing on what I initially hoped they would. The rescue of the innocent, misunderstandings, conflicted and realistic scenarios. And if they do that, that would be great. But I can't say I'm opposed to the latter. Because in spite of its Bond-esque secret societies, of its ridiculous enemy counts and map sizes, and in spite of all my criticisms of its large scale, I can't deny that Letter Triad is one of my favorite levels. It's an incredible visual treat, a showcase of some great talent behind the art team. It's got great level design, cramming in 20 suspects without ever feeling impossible or overcrowded. It's got unique new mechanics like the interactable lights, generators, caches, and helicopter. It's got a creepy atmosphere with a creepy underlying story to match. It's not realistic in the slightest, the same can be said for the entirety of Dark Waters, but with what the game has to offer, I can't say that I dislike it. Clearing this mission is a battle of endurance. While the pirates may not be much of a threat, they can wear you down by numbers alone, bringing your health down. The fully armed Black Sentinel members are the bosses of sorts, being much more durable and deadly. The mission has the game's most difficult combat scenarios and enemies, and I had a blast playing it. I had even more of a blast as ranking it. I don't think anything felt as satisfying as arresting everyone and tossing them all into this central room like a cartel arrest photo. It may just be me, but Dark Waters contains some of Radionaut's best content. Not its best stories, nor its best themes, nor its best music, but it has its best content all the same. We leave the Elysian much like how we left Port Hogan, with more questions than answers. It's easy to say that this theme, this helplessness, is exhausting because that's what most of Ready or Not's levels always seem to center around. Congratulations, you've ended this crime, but bad stuff has already happened and you haven't solved any long-term problems. There's more secrets that you'll likely never uncover. And yet this theme is not worn out because its repetition feels so intentional. Ready or Not is not necessarily trying to have a deeper meaning with this, but hey, we can draw our own interpretations for any media that we consume. To me, each mission feels like a vignette of sorts, a little peek into the darkness, following trails that seem to go on forever, being outpaced by crimes beyond what we can handle. We certainly feel helpless at times, but we are constantly inching forward ever so closer. This game is neo-noir, so thoroughly stylistic to the point of absurdity and yet so moody and grim. I've come to terms with the fact that this game is not SWAT 4, and that's okay because I could always just replay SWAT 4. With these DLCs and their commitment to deep conspiracy and large bombastic set pieces, it truly feels like Void Interactive want to cement Ready or Not's identity. It is, after all, a modern game in a gaming climate where we're more used to difficulty and intensity. SWAT 4, for all its fantastic design, is ridiculously easy with modern game sensibilities. Ends of the Earth, despite being an excellent mission, is not very interesting to replay. And we've seen with Narcos that Void can do smaller scale missions. Not that small, but still smaller than usual. Ready or Not is, at a glance, no different from Call of Duty, a comical power fantasy fiction not so subtly hidden behind serious, controversial themes. But its gameplay is less linear. In spite of its excellent gunplay, gunfights themselves feel almost secondary. Lethality is never directly rewarded outside of the intrinsic satisfaction of, well, hearing a gunshot, seeing blood splatter. Playing this game non-lethally for the Golden Watch was incredibly difficult but strangely satisfying. New DLC is on the way and I'll probably make a follow-up after 2 more have released. But I think that even now I can safely call this one of the best tactical shooters out there. It's not perfect and I doubt it ever will be. It's still evidently lacking in polish. There are parts of it that I want reworked, parts I want completely removed from the ground up. The game, in spite of having 2 DLCs already out, is still full of apparent placeholder AI art, which is still yet to be handled. I'm giving Void the benefit of the doubt when it comes to these textures and images. It may be wishful thinking. If the game didn't have such a strong foundation, I'd have abandoned it long ago. I want to see revisions. I don't know if Void will handle it because the audience for this game isn't really the kind to care about that. But I do, and I hope some things will change soon. I don't just want big set pieces, of course. One of this game's strengths is that it has both. Home Invasion, in spite of what people might say, is pretty small scale and it works wonders. Dark Waters is ridiculously large and it's just as, if not more, effective. I suppose that, for now, from my time playing, we'll just have to wait and see. Last year I made a video called An Incomplete Analysis of Ready or Not, and that was my first ever attempt at game critique, and in that video I kind of dissected every level bit by bit, like I did here. Since then, you know, my videos on games have decided to like break them down in terms of mechanics instead, like game feel, sound design, art style, and all that. But when I look back at Ready or Not, I struggle to talk about this game in any other way. You know, when you go through every mission map by map, it just feels right. Because so much of this game's substance is within them and weaved into each encounter that I would feel incomplete by not discussing them, pretty much. As much as it comes with drawbacks like, you know, potentially repetitive points, the levels are so variable in quality and visuals and like writing that I can't imagine trying to generalize the game in such a way. If you know me, you know that I'm not a very big fan of the police or of tactical realism, and yet I already liked Ready or Not in spite of its abysmal flaws from early access till launch, and by the time the Dark Waters DLC came out, I could safely call this one of my favorite games. I want him to get rid of the AI images. Man, it doesn't take a genius to look at like most paintings and photographs on the wall to see that they're made with AI, and you know, I get some of them, right? I get using it for like wanted posters or like missing children posters, but when you're depicting like a painting and when you're depicting evidence, it just feels wrong. Okay, I'm done with that. This DLC is great. I think they both succeed in different ways. My next video, maybe going back to my older style where I sort of focus on a vibe rather than a specific game. It'll either be about Satan in media or about not being afraid of dying.